Officer Cedar didn't just patrol Blackwood County, he owned it. He sat in his cruiser at the edge of the county line, watching the headlights of travelers who had no idea they were entering a zone where the Constitution was whatever Cedar decided it was that day. For 15 years, he had built a reputation as the man you didn't want to see in your rearview mirror. He targeted people he deemed disrespectful, which usually meant anyone who didn't immediately lower their gaze or offer a stuttering apology the moment he tapped on their window. In a town where everyone knew his name and feared his temper, Cedar had grown comfortable in his cruelty. He viewed his badge not as a commitment to public safety, but as a deed to the land and the people on it. To Cedar, outsiders were the greatest threat because they didn't know the local rules. They came through with their city plates and their high-end degrees, thinking their rights followed them across the county line. He took a particular pleasure in humbling those who looked like they had something to lose. He had a sixth sense for confidence, and it rubbed him the wrong way. When he saw a vehicle that looked too new or a driver who sat too straight in their seat, he felt a physical need to remind them who held the power. He had spent years refining a system of small-town shakedowns, planting just enough evidence to ensure a conviction, or intimidating witnesses until they remembered things exactly the way he wanted them to. The local courthouse was an extension of his will. The judges were his friends, and the clerks knew better than to question his paperwork. Cedar's arrogance had reached a point where he no longer felt the need to be subtle. He would openly brag at the local diner about how he had cleaned up the streets by removing anyone who dared to question his authority. He believed he was the only thing standing between the town and the chaos of the outside world, and that belief justified every lie he told on a police report. He wasn't looking for justice, he was looking for submission. On this particular evening, the air was thick with the scent of pine and oncoming rain. Cedar watched a dark truck cruise steadily past his position. It wasn't speeding, and the taillights were perfectly functional, but there was something about the way the driver handled the vehicle that caught his eye. It was too precise, too controlled. He pulled out from the shoulder, his tires kicking up gravel, and began to tail them. He waited for a slight drift over the center line or a failure to signal, but the driver was flawless. That perfection irritated him more than a violation would have. It felt like a challenge. Cedar flipped on his lights, not because he had a reason, but because he wanted to see what kind of men were inside. He watched the truck pull over immediately, a smooth transition to the shoulder that showed no sign of panic. As he stepped out of his cruiser, Cedar adjusted his belt, feeling the weight of his weapon and the authority it gave him. He didn't see two men, he saw two opportunities to assert his dominance. He had no way of knowing that Jaden and Carter were inside, men whose training made his small-town tactics look like child's play. He only saw two black men in a county where he decided who belonged. He walked toward the driver's side window with a smirk, ready to start a fire that he wouldn't be able to put out. If you come across this video, like, comment and tell me where you are watching from. The gravel crunched under the tires of the dark truck as Jaden brought it to a smooth stop on the narrow shoulder of Highway 22. In the passenger seat, Carter didn't move, but his posture changed, his eyes shifting to the side mirror. They had just spent 18 months in environments where a sudden stop meant an ambush, and although they were back on American soil, the instinct hadn't faded. Behind them, the red and blue lights of Officer Cedar's cruiser pulsed against the dark tree line. Jaden kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, his breathing rhythmic and shallow. He knew the procedure, and he knew the stakes for two black men in a county that didn't see many visitors. Officer Cedar approached the driver's side with his hand resting heavily on the grip of his service weapon. He didn't lead with a greeting. He stood just behind the door pillar, casting a flashlight beam that cut jaggedly across Jaden's face. He demanded license and registration before Jaden could even ask why he'd been stopped. Jaden reached for his wallet with slow, deliberate movements, placing his military ID on top of his driver's license. He handed them over without a word. Cedar glanced at the IDs for a split second before dropping them onto the floor of the truck. He claimed he couldn't read them in the dark and ordered Jaden to step out of the vehicle. Carter spoke up then, his voice low and steady, asking the legal basis for the exit order. Cedar's reaction was instantaneous. He didn't appreciate the question, and he certainly didn't appreciate the lack of fear in Carter's tone. He barked into his radio for backup, claiming he had two combative subjects, refusing to comply. The air between the men turned electric. Jaden stepped out, moving slowly to show he wasn't a threat, but his sheer size made Cedar retreat a step. The officer's insecurity was visible in the way his hand shook as he reached for his pepper spray. He began a rapid-fire interrogation, asking where they were coming from and what they were doing in his town, dismissing their answers about returning from deployment as lies. When the second cruiser screeched to a halt behind them, the situation spiraled. The new officer didn't ask questions, he followed Cedar's lead. Cedar claimed he smelled something suspicious in the cab and moved to drag Carter out of the passenger side. Carter stood his ground for a moment, asserting his rights, which Cedar interpreted as physical resistance. Cedar lunged, grabbing Carter by the collar of his jacket and slamming him against the side of the truck. The sound of the impact echoed in the quiet night. Jaden took half a step forward to intervene, and immediately, 2 pistols were leveled at his chest. Cedar was shouting now, a frantic, jagged noise that didn't match the calm of the 2 men he was trying to break. He forced Carter to the ground, pressing a knee into the small of his back while fumbling for his handcuffs. He wasn't just making an arrest, he was trying to inflict pain. He twisted Carter's arm at an angle that would have snapped a civilian's shoulder, but Carter stayed silent, his face pressed into the dirt. Once Carter was secured, Cedar turned his attention to Jaden, his face flushed with a mixture of adrenaline and malice. He told Jaden that they were going to learn that their fancy badges didn't mean anything in Blackwood. The handcuffs ratcheted shut on Jaden's wrists with a final, metallic click, marking the beginning of a legal nightmare they never saw coming. The heavy iron door of the Blackwood County Intake Center slammed shut, echoing with a finality that usually broke most men. Jaden and Carter stood in the middle of the fluorescent-lit processing room, still in their dirt-stained civilian clothes, their wrists chafed from the tight plastic zip ties Cedar had swapped for metal cuffs during the transport. Cedar stood behind the booking counter, a look of smug satisfaction on his face as he began the process of erasing who these men actually were. He didn't see heroes, he saw paperwork he could manipulate. Cedar reached into a plastic evidence bag containing their personal effects. He pulled out Jaden's wallet and fished out the military ID card. He held it up to the light, turning it slowly. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, he dropped it into a heavy-duty shredder sitting behind the desk. The machine groaned as the high-grade plastic was chewed into unrecognizable bits. He did the same with Carter's. When Carter spoke up, stating that destroying government property was a federal offense, Cedar just leaned over the counter and told him that in this building, the only government that mattered was the one wearing his name tag. The processing continued with a cold, calculated efficiency. Cedar lost their cell phones, claiming they were never recovered from the vehicle. He bypassed the standard inventory logs, failing to record their specialized watches and the tactical gear they had stored in the truck. By the time he was finished, on paper, Jaden and Carter were just 2 unemployed transients caught with intent to distribute and resisting arrest. He stripped them of their dignity next, forcing them out of their clothes and into thin, ill-fitting tan scrubs. The image of the 2 elite warriors standing in the drab prison uniform was exactly what Cedar wanted. It made them look like the criminals he had decided they were. Every time Jaden tried to give his service number or ask for his one allotted phone call to his commanding officer, Cedar would simply walk away or turn up the volume on a nearby radio. He was intentionally isolating them, cutting every thread that connected them to the United States Navy. He knew that as long as they were John Does in his system, he could keep the narrative under his control. He moved them toward the holding cells, the floor cold beneath their bare feet. He made sure to tell the evening shift guards that these 2 were high-risk and uncooperative, ensuring they would be treated with maximum friction. As the cell door slid into place, Cedar lingered for a second, looking through the small observation window. He told them that nobody was coming for them because, as far as the world was concerned, they didn't exist in Blackwood. He walked away, leaving them in a cramped, concrete box that smelled of bleach and old sweat. Jaden sat on the edge of the narrow cot, his jaw tight. He looked at Carter, who was already assessing the corners of the cell. They had been stripped of their uniforms, their IDs, and their gear, but Cedar had made a fundamental mistake. He thought the honor was in the objects he destroyed, not in the men themselves. Cedar pulled Jaden from the cell at 3 in the morning, banking on exhaustion to do the heavy lifting. He led him into a small, windowless room that smelled of stale cigarettes and floor wax, leaving Carter behind in the dark. Cedar didn't use a recording device, he didn't want a trail. He sat across from Jaden, leaning into his space, and began a slow, repetitive verbal assault. He told Jaden that Carter had already started talking, claiming that the SEAL story was a lie they'd cooked up to cover for a drug run. Jaden didn't blink. He sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall just behind Cedar's head. He wasn't ignoring the officer, he was cataloging him, watching the way Cedar's pulse throbbed in his neck whenever Jaden stayed silent. When Cedar realized he wasn't getting a reaction, he changed tactics. He started insulting the Navy, calling them glorified swimmers, and mocking the idea that they were elite. He was looking for a flash of anger, a defensive remark, or any movement that he could characterize as a threat. Jaden remained a statue. He was running through a mental checklist of his training, compartmentalizing the room and the man in front of him. In his mind, this wasn't an interrogation, it was a mission of endurance. He knew that any word he spoke would be twisted, so he gave Cedar nothing but the sound of his own frustrated breathing. An hour later, Cedar swapped them out, bringing Carter in and putting Jaden back. As they passed each other in the narrow, dimly lit hallway, their shoulders brushed. It looked like a clumsy accident to the guard holding Jaden's arm, but it was a deliberate, tactical touch. Jaden tapped a specific rhythm against Carter's forearm, a 3-beat sequence that meant hold the line, no compromise. Carter didn't nod, but his posture tightened. They were using the non-verbal cues they had mastered in the field, communication that didn't require breath or sound. Inside the room, Cedar tried to play on Carter's future. He talked about how a felony conviction would strip him of his benefits, his pension, and his right to carry a firearm. He offered Carter a way out if he would just sign a statement saying Jaden was the one who initiated the resistance during the stop. Carter looked Cedar directly in the eye, his expression one of pure, detached observation. He began to use hand signals, subtly shifting his fingers against his knee where Cedar couldn't see them through the edge of the table. He was talking to the mirror, assuming someone might be watching from the other side. He signaled a code for coercion in progress followed by target is unstable. The more Cedar pushed, the more the power dynamic shifted. He was the one sweating, his voice rising in pitch as he realized these men weren't afraid of him. He slammed his hand on the table, demanding a response, and Carter simply asked for his lawyer and his notification to the JAG office. That request made Cedar snap. He realized that his usual methods of breaking local kids and drifters were useless against men who had been trained to survive actual torture. He sent them back to the cell, his face a mask of panicked rage. He had isolated them physically, but mentally, Jaden and Carter were more connected than ever. They sat in the silence of their cell, communicating through microgestures and shared breathing patterns, waiting for the crack in the system they knew was coming. Elias was a man who spent his nights pushing a mop through the hallways of the Blackwood County Sheriff's Department, staying invisible by choice. He was an Army veteran who had seen enough of the world to know when something was wrong, and the way Officer Cedar was hovering around holding Cell 4 was a massive red flag. Elias watched from the shadows of the utility closet as Cedar left the area, looking more agitated than usual. Taking his chance, Elias moved his cleaning cart toward the bars of Cell 4, splashing a bit of soapy water near the threshold to justify lingering. He saw them immediately. Jaden and Carter were sitting on their cots, their backs straight and their eyes fixed on the door. It wasn't the way a typical prisoner sat. It was the posture of men who were waiting for a signal. As Elias mopped closer to the bars, Jaden shifted his arm, and the sleeve of his tan prison scrub rode up just enough to reveal a portion of a trident tattoo on his forearm. Elias stopped moving. He knew that mark. It wasn't something you could buy at a strip mall parlor, it was earned in the surf of Coronado. He looked at Carter and saw the same disciplined focus in his eyes. Elias didn't say a word at first. He just kept mopping, but he angled his body so the surveillance camera at the end of the hall couldn't see his face. He whispered, low and rasping, asking them their names and their unit. Jaden didn't hesitate. He recognized the look in the old man's eyes, the look of someone who had once worn the uniform. He gave Elias his full name and a specific contact number for a duty officer at the Naval Special Warfare Command. He told Elias that Cedar had shredded their IDs and was burying their paperwork. Carter added a brief string of numbers, a coordinate and a timestamp, that would verify their identity to anyone on the other end of that phone line. The sound of heavy boots echoed from the far end of the corridor. Elias immediately went back to his work, splashing the floor and whistling a tuneless song as a deputy rounded the corner. The deputy told Elias to hurry it up and get out of the cell block. Elias nodded, played the part of the tired old janitor, and pushed his cart back to the supply room. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He knew that if Cedar caught him interfering with department business, he'd lose his job and likely find himself in one of those cells. He waited until his shift ended at 5 in the morning. Instead of going to his car, he walked 2 blocks to a rusted payphone outside a shuttered gas station, one of the few that still worked in town. He didn't want a digital trail on his cell phone. He dialed the number Jaden had given him, his hands shaking as the line clicked and a voice on the other end answered with a cold, professional greeting. Elias didn't waste time with a backstory. He gave the names, the location of the Blackwood County Jail, and the codes Jaden had provided. He told the man on the line that 2 of their own were being erased by a corrupt cop and that they needed help before the morning court session began. The voice on the other end went from professional to lethal in a second, asking Elias to repeat the location one more time. Once Elias finished, the man told him to go home and stay quiet. As Elias hung up the receiver, he looked toward the horizon where the first light of dawn was breaking. He had done his part. He knew the machine he had just set in motion was far larger than anything Officer Cedar could handle. The Navy didn't just forget about its elite, and by the time the sun was fully up, Blackwood County was going to be the center of a very large, very angry world. The bailiff called the court to order at 9 sharp, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls of a room that had seen more deals than justice. Jaden and Carter were led in through the side door, the heavy rattle of their ankle chains cutting through the low murmur of the gallery. They were dressed in the same thin, tan scrubs they had been issued at intake, their hands cuffed in front of them. To any casual observer, they looked like broken men, their heads slightly bowed and their shoulders slumped under the weight of the system. But those who knew them would have seen the way their eyes never stopped moving, cataloging the exits, the guards, and the nervous twitch in Officer Cedar's jaw as he sat at the prosecution table. Cedar had spent the morning coaching the local prosecutor, a man who relied on Cedar's arrests to keep his conviction rates high. The charges they read aloud were a work of fiction: felony possession with intent to distribute, resisting arrest with violence, and criminal conspiracy. As the prosecutor laid out the narrative of a dangerous roadside confrontation, Jaden felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, but he kept it locked down. He remained internally focused, repeating his service number like a mantra in his head to stay grounded. He looked over at Carter and saw his teammate doing the same, his breathing so shallow and rhythmic it was almost invisible. The judge, a man who had shared Sunday dinners with Cedar for a decade, barely looked up from his paperwork. He asked if the defendants had counsel, knowing full well that Cedar had blocked their access to a phone. When Jaden stood up to speak, to state clearly and for the record that they were active-duty United States Navy SEALs being held against their will, the judge cut him off with a sharp rap of his gavel. He told Jaden that his military fantasies wouldn't help him here and that they would proceed with a court-appointed representative who hadn't even met them yet. It was a streamlined execution of their civil rights, designed to move them through the system before anyone outside the county line noticed they were missing. Cedar leaned back in his chair, a thin smile playing on his lips as he watched the judge prepare to set a bail amount he knew they couldn't pay. He felt untouchable. He had destroyed the IDs, he had intimidated the witnesses, and he had the local judiciary in his pocket. He didn't notice the court clerk's phone vibrating incessantly on the desk, or the way the back doors of the courtroom were being watched by 2 men in civilian suits who definitely didn't look like they were from Blackwood. Jaden and Carter felt the shift in the room's energy before anyone else did. They heard the heavy, synchronized footsteps in the hallway, the kind of gait that only comes from years of marching on deck plates. The prosecutor was mid-sentence, describing the threat the 2 men posed to the community, when the heavy double doors at the rear of the courtroom were thrown open with such force they hit the buffers with a loud crack. The room went silent. The judge looked up, ready to bark an order about contempt of court, but the words died in his throat. Officer Cedar stood up, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster, but he froze halfway. Every eye in the room was fixed on the tall, silver-haired man walking down the center aisle in a pristine white uniform, the gold stripes on his sleeves catching the fluorescent light. It wasn't just a lawyer or a concerned citizen, it was the kind of authority that made the small-town power in the room feel suddenly, dangerously insignificant. Admiral Braxton didn't wait for the bailiff to announce him. He moved down the center aisle with a speed and purpose that made the armed guards near the bench instinctively step back. The crisp white of his dress uniform looked like a spotlight in the dim, wood-paneled room, and the 4 stars on his shoulders seemed to carry more weight than the judge's gavel ever could. Behind him followed 3 officers in short-sleeved khakis, carrying thin laptops and leather-bound folders. The room was so silent you could hear the rhythmic clicking of Braxton's polished shoes against the floor. He didn't stop at the gallery rail. He walked straight into the well of the court, ignoring the prosecutor who had scrambled to his feet to object. Braxton's eyes locked onto Jaden and Carter first. He didn't offer a smile, but his gaze was a silent acknowledgement of their discipline. He then turned his attention to the bench. The judge, who had been ready to sustain Cedar's fabricated charges, looked like he wanted to disappear into his robes. Braxton didn't ask for permission to speak, he simply placed a hand on the defense table and informed the court that he was taking jurisdiction over the 2 men standing in shackles. Officer Cedar finally found his voice, though it was thin and brittle. He started to stammer about local procedure and the seriousness of the felony charges, but Braxton turned to face him, and the words died in Cedar's throat. The Admiral didn't yell. He spoke in a low, level tone that carried to every corner of the room, stating that he was well aware of the procedure used in this county. He told Cedar that his department had successfully obstructed a federal investigation by detaining 2 operators who were on active duty orders. As he spoke, one of the officers behind him opened a laptop and turned the screen toward the judge, displaying a live feed of federal authorization documents that overrode the local docket. The panic in the room was physical. Cedar's hand began to twitch at his side, his eyes darting toward the exits as he realized the vacuum he'd been operating in had just been shattered. The judge tried to regain some semblance of authority, asking for the Admiral's credentials. Braxton reached into his pocket, pulled out a gold-trimmed ID, and laid it on the bench with a sharp snap. He told the judge that his name was Braxton, and that the men in the tan scrubs were his property by law. He then looked directly at Cedar and informed him that the United States Navy did not take kindly to its personnel being kidnapped and their government-issued identification being destroyed. Cedar tried to back away, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He looked toward the prosecutor for help, but the man was already closing his briefcase, trying to distance himself from the wreckage of the case. Braxton didn't let up. He informed the court that a team of federal investigators was currently at the Blackwood Sheriff's Office, recovering the shredded remnants of military IDs and the dashboard camera footage that Cedar thought he had erased. The storm wasn't coming, it was already there. As Braxton signaled to his aides, the bailiff moved forward, not to restrain the Admiral, but to begin unlocking the chains on Jaden and Carter's wrists. The power in the room had shifted so completely that Cedar looked like a ghost in his own uniform, realizing that his 15-year reign of corruption had just ended in a matter of seconds. Admiral Braxton signaled to one of the officers in khakis, who immediately bypassed the local court's outdated projection system and synced a hardened military tablet to the wall monitors. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy but high-resolution aerial view of Highway 22. It was thermal satellite footage, timestamped to the exact minute of the arrest. The courtroom watched in dead silence as the heat signatures of Cedar's cruiser and Jaden's truck appeared on screen. The footage clearly showed Cedar walking to the passenger side of the truck, pausing, and then dropping a small, glowing heat source, a bag of planted narcotics, into the bed of the truck before he ever made contact with the men. Braxton turned his back to the screen, his eyes boring into the judge. He didn't need to describe what everyone had just seen. Instead, he pulled a digital recorder from his aides folder and pressed play. The room filled with the sound of static, followed by Cedar's voice, clear and unmistakable. It wasn't a standard radio transmission, it was a captured private cell phone call Cedar had made to the local prosecutor 30 minutes after the arrest. In the recording, Cedar laughed about bagging 2 big fish and joked that he destroyed their military IDs so they'd have no way to prove who they were until they were already processed into the state system. The Admiral explained to the court that Jaden and Carter's vehicle was equipped with an active transponder and a secure internal dashcam that uploaded directly to a Navy server the moment the vehicle's alarm system was triggered by Cedar's forceful entry. Cedar had thought he disabled the camera by ripping it off the windshield, but the data had already been beamed to a satellite 10 minutes before he touched it. Braxton then presented a second set of documents, forensic recovery logs from the shredder at the precinct. A team of JAG investigators had already secured the building, and they had found the microchips from the SEAL's IDs, which had survived the shredding process. The judge's face was pale, his hands trembling as he looked at the evidence. He realized that this wasn't just a case of local misconduct, it was a federal disaster. Braxton pointed a gloved finger at the evidence table where Cedar's proof sat, the bag of drugs Cedar had claimed belonged to the SEALs. He informed the court that the Navy's lab had already run a remote trace on the batch numbers of that specific narcotic. It matched a shipment seized by Cedar's department 6 months ago that had never been checked into the official evidence locker. Cedar stood frozen, his eyes darting from the monitor to the Admiral. He looked like a man who had been playing checkers while his opponent was using a drone to watch his every move. He tried to speak, to claim the evidence was inadmissible or fabricated, but Braxton cut him off with a single sentence. He told the court that the evidence wasn't being presented for a trial in Blackwood County, but as the basis for a federal warrant that was being served at that very moment. The Admiral wasn't there to win an argument, he was there to document a crime scene. He looked at the bailiff and told him that if he didn't unhook the SEALs immediately, he would be cited for obstruction along with the rest of the department. The bailiff's keys rattled in the lock of Jaden's shackles, a sharp, metallic sound that signaled the end of the farce. As the heavy iron rings fell away, Jaden and Carter stood up, rubbing the red welts on their wrists. They didn't look like victims anymore. Even in the drab tan scrubs, their presence filled the room as they fell into a loose, tactical formation behind Admiral Braxton. The air in the courtroom had turned cold for Officer Cedar. He was backed into the corner of the prosecution table, his face a pale mask of sweat and disbelief. He looked toward the judge for a lifeline, but the judge was busy staring at his own hands, realizing that his association with Cedar was now a career-ending liability. The back doors of the courtroom swung open for the second time, but this wasn't a military entrance. Four state troopers in gray uniforms marched in, followed by 2 plainclothes investigators from the state attorney's office. They didn't stop to talk to the local bailiff or the court clerk. They walked straight to Officer Cedar. The lead trooper informed Cedar that he was being placed under arrest for civil rights violations, tampering with evidence, and official misconduct. Cedar tried to protest, his voice cracking as he reached for the badge on his chest, but the trooper didn't hesitate. He spun Cedar around, forced his arms behind his back, and clicked a pair of standard-issue steel handcuffs onto the wrists of the man who had spent 15 years doing the same to innocent people. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the gallery. As Cedar was led out through the center aisle, he had to pass directly by Jaden and Carter. He kept his eyes on the floor, unable to look at the men he had tried to erase. The silence was absolute until Jaden leaned in slightly as Cedar passed, his voice low and steady, telling him that the truth always finds its way out. There was no shouting, no celebration, just the quiet satisfaction of a predator finally becoming the prey. Cedar was marched out of the building he had treated like a private kingdom, headed for a transport van that would take him to a facility far away from his local influence. Admiral Braxton turned to Jaden and Carter. He didn't offer a speech about justice or a lecture on their restraint. He simply nodded, a gesture of profound respect from a commander to his men. He told them their truck had been recovered and their gear was being processed by a clean team from the base. One of the Admiral's aides stepped forward, handing both men a fresh set of IDs and their personal cell phones, which had been recovered from Cedar's private locker. The restoration of their identity was immediate. They were no longer inmates or subjects, they were elite members of the United States Navy once again. As they walked out of the courthouse, the midday sun hit the white of the Admiral's uniform, making the 4 stars on his shoulders shine. Reporters and locals had gathered on the steps, sensing the shift in the town's foundation. Jaden and Carter stopped at the top of the stairs, taking a breath of the open air for the first time in days. They stood at attention as the Admiral's staff car pulled up. Before entering the vehicle, Jaden and Carter snapped a sharp, synchronized salute to Braxton, a final acknowledgement of the leadership that had pulled them from the dark. They stepped into the car and drove away from Blackwood County, leaving the corruption to be burned out by the federal investigation they had left in their wake.
Thank you for watching this video. Hit the subscribe button, like, and comment to get more videos that deserves justice.